A lot to discuss. Let's meet our panel. James Goldgeier, a visiting senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He joins us right here in the studio. From London, Alexander Nekrassov is a former advisor to the Russian government. Metin Gurcan is a security analyst and commentator. He joins us from Istanbul. And from Berlin, Paul Hockenos is a journalist and freelance writer. Welcome to all of you to the show. James, let's start right here in the studio. NATO was created in the aftermath of World War II to counter the Soviet bloc. It was a time of a big ideological divide in Europe, the communist East, the capitalist West. That divide is no longer there. The Soviet bloc is no longer there. So do we still need a Western defense alliance like NATO?
Well, that question's been asked ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, and NATO certainly has continued to find things to do since the late 80s, early 90s, going to war in the Balkans in the 1990s, using the alliance to try to encourage democracy and respect for rule of law in Central and Eastern Europe as those countries wanted to come in. And it's still an organization. It binds the United States and Europe together. It's important in that respect, especially given the challenges to both the United States and Europe that arise elsewhere. And it's really the only institution that can do the things that it does. When the UN needed escorts for ships bringing food to Africa a decade or so ago and needed to deal with the piracy issue, called on NATO. When Indonesia had a tsunami and there needed to be supplies airlifted in, there was NATO. Libya war in 2011, the UN authorized NATO to go to war to protect the population of Benghazi. So it's important both in the transatlantic context and because there's nothing else like it.
Let's go to Alexander in London. And Alexander, whatever threat the Soviet bloc posed at the time, that is now clearly over. So do you think there's still a need for NATO?
Well, first of all, I find it deeply, well, tragic irony, maybe I call it, that the current, the last NATO meeting is taking place on a territory of the country that has attacked the former Soviet Union and Russia included, has caused untold damage to Russia, has never offered to repay any reparations to Russia. And now this same country is hosting other countries that are saying that Russia is a threat to the West. This is so preposterous and tragic in the same time, and ironic too, that we are now talking about the danger from Russia. Now, at this meeting in NATO, a lot of words were said about the new threat from Russia, the cyber attacks and so on. And no proof was given, as usual. It is all sort of, sort of mysterious proof that nobody has ever seen. Now, NATO itself, the reason why we see this happening is that there is no need for NATO. NATO is the cause of the current problem in Europe, because NATO was spreading eastwards against all agreements, all understandings with the Soviet Union and later Russia. This was the main tension. This was the problem that was created between Russia and the West. And now we are talking about this same organization that has caused so much problems for Europe and relations with Russia. This same organization is suddenly assuming an aggressive posture. I find it deeply, deeply disgraceful.
Alexander, I just want to clarify something. You say the defense ministers' meeting took place in a country that attacked Russia. That meeting took place in Brussels.
No, I'm telling about the final phase, the Munich conference, and where the Russian threat has been discussed. I'm sorry, I didn't make it clear. Obviously, it's in Brussels. But the problem, as I said, this is the problem for Europe, NATO. NATO should have been disbanded once the Soviet Union disbanded the Warsaw Pact and basically fell apart. Now, all of these explanations, because NATO, we need it for humanitarian reasons, for fighting terrorism and so on, this doesn't stand. This doesn't work.
Okay, let's go to Paul in Berlin. And Paul, NATO was active in the European theater, as it's called. But now we see NATO involved in other parts of the world, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. It was involved in the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. So when you look at NATO's involvement in other parts of the world, how significantly has its initial mandate changed?
Well, completely. I mean, NATO was a Cold War fixture, and it was pretty clear back then there was just the East and the West. Now it's become a much stranger monstrosity because it's partly still a relic of the past. Much of it hasn't changed, and yet it has also changed over the decades. To the point, though, that now you've got different members with different needs. I think of NATO as being kind of like a town in the Old West, where you have a sheriff, and the sheriff is the United States. And every time that sheriff has a problem, he comes out in the town, and he asks all the men in the town, will they help him do this, that, or the other thing? He gets a certain number to sign up, and they do it. The most important, or at least one of the most important aspects of NATO for Europe is Article 5. It's one for all and all for one collective security law. That still the United States is still the nuclear umbrella over Europe and is absolutely essential for Europe's defense. And yet you have all kinds of different interests now, including, of course, recently President Trump, who less than a year ago was downplaying NATO and the United States' commitment to it. So it's really quite unclear where we are right now.
Let's go to Metin in Istanbul. And Metin, NATO was created at a time when the big threat was the threat of a conventional war with national armies facing off against each other. Of course, now that's changed. Now we have the threat coming from non-state actors, groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIL. So we've seen that in Turkey, of course. Sometimes this is referred to as asymmetric warfare. Has NATO adapted to this new challenge, do you think?
Very good question. And let me start with this. I served in Afghanistan several times as an ex-military officer within the flanks of NATO. So I'm familiar with NATO's way of thinking and doing things. But the point that you raised is extremely important. Changing global security environment and changing threats and attempts to transform itself to adapt to the new security environment. So these are the challenges right now NATO has been facing with, and I would suggest that I am still inclined to think that NATO is still a very relevant security actor in the international domain. But when you when you analyze NATO's actions and the impact of these actions in past 4 or 5 years, with a specific focus on Syria, Iraq, and the regional security in the Middle East, then I would suggest that NATO's actions have been becoming much more irrelevant, and they cannot produce impacts on the tackling with those violent non-state actors emerging in the wider Middle East. And in Turkey, let me provide the Turkish perspective. Despite the fact that Turkey has been an active NATO member for almost 6 decades, we see a sort of structural crisis, a trust-related crisis between Turkey and NATO, despite the fact that Turkey is a very active NATO member. The anti-NATO sentiment in Turkey has been in a sort of increasing trend,
right.
And then we have to focus on the whys and what's of this increasing trend.